Hello, everyone. My name is Reverend Abraham Smith, Jr., pastor of First AME Church here in Alexandria. I will be your host today as we celebrate the life and legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Ventures of Community, better known as VIC, is sponsoring this annual celebration. VIC is comprised of faith communities and other nonprofits in Southeast Fairfax County. Our theme this year is Truth and Justice, remembering his voice, his mission. No lie can live forever. Our focus is centered on Dr. King's speech, Give Us the Ballot, given on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial on May 17, 1957. Over 20,000 people listened to 3 hours of speeches, music, and testimony from a host of Southern activists. Our intent today is to share 30 minutes of remembering Dr. King's voice and his mission. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Ralph Smith. I'm currently a member of the Manassas City, Virginia City Council. I come to you today, though, based on my community activism and the work I've done in the community throughout my life. I want to talk to you today about voting and voting rights and why we must act, and we must act now. Martin Luther King's first speech at the Lincoln Memorial was not his celebrated 1963 address at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. 6 years earlier, when he was still a relative newcomer on the national scene, Dr. King addressed 25,000 civil rights activists who had gathered at the memorial for the prayer pilgrimage for freedom on May 17, 1957. History has not accorded quite so much attention to the speech King delivered that day, but the tenor of these times invites us to embrace his message once more. Noting the open defiance that was preventing implementation of the Supreme Court's Brown versus Board of Education ruling, King suggested that the betrayal of disenfranchised Americans by politicians of both parties offered the ultimate argument for why the struggle for voting rights is so essential to the broader struggle for economic and social justice, environmental protection, and peace. Quoting Dr. King, "The denial of this sacred right is a tragic betrayal of the highest mandates of democratic tradition. And so our most urgent request to the President of the United States and every member of Congress is to give us the right to vote." King declared that in 1957. Those words are appropriate in 2022. So I want to recall how past practices have shaped the present, and that reminds us that changing today's policies can improve the future. So the central theme of this message to you today is the history is racism, systemic racism, interpersonal and structural, and the consequences of practices that embrace such hierarchies of human value. The long struggle for African American voting rights has been part of a centuries-old effort to ensure that the United States Constitution applied to all citizens, not just white male landowners. One of our major goals of the Civil Rights Movement was to register voters across the South in order for African Americans to gain political power. I speak to the history of our fight for voting rights from personal experience. I was involved in the Civil Rights Movement in the early 60s. I was involved in voter registration drives, driving voters to the polls to vote, driving them to the registrar's office to register, teaching literacy classes to those for the purposes of voter registration, and encouraging local African Americans to run as candidates. The struggle was difficult. Working as part of Freedom Summer in 1962 in Mississippi, a story about a local minister named Reverend Lee who was shot and killed for registered voters in the mid-1950s weighed heavily on my mind and caused me to pause for a moment and to decide whether this really was something I should be involved in. That event, as did all the retaliations against those who dared to register voters. I did receive some of that retaliation. The worst, though, during that time came upon Michael Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andrew Goodman. Those three young men went missing for a period of time that summer and was later found dead. They were slaughtered at the hands of people who simply did not want us to vote. We had been working with the Freedom Summer campaign by encouraging African Americans in Mississippi to register and vote. In some instances, that also entailed teaching them how to read, especially how to read ballots, and pass mandatory tests that election officials administered. See, since 1890 and through the turn of the century, Southern states have systematically disenfranchised most black voters by discrimination in voter registration and voting. Despite the passage of many constitutional amendments and Supreme Court cases, the full participation of every American citizen in elections is an ideal to this day that has never been reached. But voting is one of America's most cherished democratic liberties, and it has a long and storied history. The Founding Fathers saw voting as a fundamental component of the democracy and a perfect union that they sought to create. Despite that, the right to vote was denied for many populations for centuries. Many amendments were passed to the Constitution were passed that gave freed African Americans citizenship, but they wouldn't get the right to vote for another 2 years. And even then, Southern states used a variety of tactics to suppress African American turnout for nearly a century afterwards. So after decades of hard-fought civil rights activism, Congress finally passed and President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the landmark Voting Rights Act into law. That act outlawed several racially discriminatory practices that were intended to keep people of color from voting. The Voting Rights Act then also directed the Department of Justice to oversee voter registration efforts in counties where less than half of the African American population was registered, and required that those places with a history of discrimination obtain pre-clearance from the Department of Justice before implementing any new voting policies. Sadly, the Supreme Court in 2013, in a decision in Shelby County versus Holder, the Supreme Court rolled back the pre-clearance provision of the Voting Rights Act. So it no longer required counties with histories of racial discrimination to be, quote, covered under the Act. So while voting rights in America have come a long way towards ensuring equal ballot access for all, many of us will still argue that overtly Jim Crow laws of the past have given way to discriminatory practices of today. Discriminatory practices like voter ID, cuts to early voting, polling place closures, limited absentee voting, 6 voting ID laws, and other restrictions enacted by Texas and North Carolina in the wake of the Shelby County versus Holder was struck down in federal court, with one court, the appeals court, finding that the North Carolina law targeted African Americans with almost surgical precision. Yet, among all those and all of that passed, in 2018, former Secretary of State and current Governor Brian Kemp was accused of putting 53,000 voter registration applications, quote, on hold, supposedly for mismatched names. But he also incorrectly purged 340,000 voters from the poll. So throughout United States history, restricted access to the ballot in political office has prevented black people from holding power and implementing policies that will help our communities. We no longer see literacy tests, and poll taxes. There are more subtle forms of voter suppression that continue and are increasing in many states. People of color now face a resurgence in white supremacy and political efforts to erode civil liberties. Nationally, minorities and low-income voters are much more likely than whites to have transportation issues on election day. Additionally, black voters are less likely to request absentee ballots. Some of it, the reason, is out of distrust of the system. That distrust has been justified very recently in North Carolina, where black voters were twice as likely to have mail-in ballots rejected. So Martin Luther King's call to give us the ballot is as relevant today as it was in 1957. And that's a mark of how endangered our voting rights are now. There are many ways in which King's legacy can and should be celebrated. We must get inspired by a passionate faith that the best way in which to celebrate King's Give Us the Ballot vision is to renew and extend that vision in the 21st century. This is urgent work, and it's urgent work of our time, but we must embrace it with a sense of mission that combines a righteous indignation and audacious hope that was expressed more than 60 years ago. King spoke then of how threats to the rule of law and the promise of American democracy had risen to ominous proportions. The threats to voting rights, to voter justice, to government of, by, and for the people have risen anew. It is again the case, as King concluded in 1957, that the hour is late. The clock of destiny is ticking out. We must act now before it's too late. We must indeed, Martin. We must indeed. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jan Buchanan, and I'm the former executive director of Mount Vernon at Home, a nonprofit organization that supports seniors aging in their homes and communities. In his 1957 speech at the Lincoln Memorial, titled, "Give Us the Ballot," Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. dwells on the profound necessity of eliminating minority injustices. Now, more than 60 years later, there is a feeling among many that in some senses, time has stood still for African Americans and other minorities and people of color. Dr. King introduced his 1957 speech citing the 1954 Supreme Court decision, Brown versus the Board of Education, aimed at bringing equality to school systems throughout America. On this front, there has been progress, but many minority youths still struggle academically because of issues like food insecurity and lack of decent housing in impoverished and crime-ridden neighborhoods. As to possible remedies for such inequity, Dr. King talks about how minorities must secure the right to vote. He lists obstacles to this right that exist in 1957. But if the words were isolated and unidentified, many would interpret them as a description of what is happening today in states that have passed or attempted to pass legislation that many fear would suppress the right to vote among minorities. We will now hear some of the excerpts of this speech by Dr. King, read by our area youth. Thank you.
My name is Don Giraneza, and I will be reading for you. Unfortunately, this noble and sublime decision has not gone without opposition. This opposition has often risen to ominous proportions. Many states have risen up in open defiance. The legislative halls of the South ring loud with such words as interposition and nullification. But even more, all types of conniving methods are still being used to prevent Negroes from becoming registered voters. The denial of this sacred right is a tragic betrayal of the highest mandates of our democratic tradition. And so our most urgent request to the President of the United States and every member of Congress is to give us the right to vote. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mia.
I'm Jeremy.
And we'll be reading an excerpt from an MLK speech. This is no day for the rebel rouser, whether he be Negro or white. We must realize that we are grappling with the most weighty social problem of this nation, and in grappling with such a complex problem, there is no place for the misguided emotionalism. We must work passionately and unrelentingly for the goal of freedom, but we must also be sure that our hands are clean in the struggle. We must never struggle with falsehood, hate, or malice. We must never become bitter.
We must meet hate with love. We must meet physical force with soul force. There is still a voice crying out through the vista of time, saying, "Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, pray for them that despitefully use you. Then, and only then, can you matriculate into the university of eternal life." That same voice cries out in terms lifted to cosmic proportions. He who lives by the sword will perish by the sword. And history is replete with the bleached bones of nations that failed to follow this command. We must follow nonviolence and love.
I'm Finn French, and I'm reading from an MLK Jr. speech. If the executive and legislative branches of the government were as concerned about the protection of our citizenship rights as the federal courts have been, then the transition from a segregated to an integrated society would be infinitely smoother. But we so often look to Washington in vain for this concern. In the midst of the tragic breakdown of law and order, the executive branch of the government is all too silent and apathetic. In the midst of the desperate need for civil rights legislation, the legislative branch of the government is all too stagnant and hypocritical. This dearth of positive leadership from the federal government is not confined to one particular political party. Both political parties have betrayed the cause of justice. The Democrats have betrayed it by capitulating to the prejudices and undemocratic practices of the Southern Dixiecrats. The Republicans have betrayed it by capitulating to the blatant hypocrisy of the right-wing reactionary Northerners. These men so often have a high blood pressure of words and an anemia of deeds. Thank you.
I'm Marley Tinnen, and I'm going to be reading from the MLK speech. We talk a great deal about our rights, and rightly so, but we must not, however, remain satisfied with a court victory over our white brothers. We must respond to every decision with an understanding of those who have opposed us and with an appreciation of the difficult adjustments that the court orders pose for them. We must act in such a way as to make possible a coming together of white people and colored people on the basis of a real harmony of interest and understanding. We must seek an integration based on mutual respect. And those of us who call the name of Jesus Christ find something of an event in our Christian faith that tells us this. There is something in our faith that says to us, never despair, never give up, never feel that the cause of righteousness and justice is doomed.
My name is Don Granenza, and I will be reading to you today. Go out with faith today. I realize that it will cause restless nights sometimes. It might cause losing a job. It will cause suffering and sacrifice. It might even cause physical death for some. But if physical death is the price that some must pay to free their children from a permanent life of psychological death, then nothing can be more Christian. Keep going today. Keep moving amid every obstacle. Keep moving amid every mountain of opposition. If you will do that with dignity, when the history books are written in the future, the historians will have a look back and say, there lived a great people, a people with fleecy locks and black complexion, but a people who injected new meaning into the veins of civilization, a people which stood up with dignity and honor and saved Western civilization in her darkest hour, people that gave new integrity and new dimension of love to our civilization. Thank you.
Each of us has a moral responsibility if we are of voting age and if we are registered to participate in that decision. So I come to California today, and I'll leave here and go to Chicago and then to Detroit and then Baltimore, Maryland, and New York to say the same thing. I come here to urge every person under the sound of my voice to go to the polls on the 3rd of November and vote your conviction. Now, I know you're intelligent people, and I don't need to tell you who you should vote for. I don't have any fear about that. You know who to vote for. I'm just asking you to vote. Now, just if you need Now, if you need a little information on my convictions at this point, I must honestly admit to you that I am not going to vote for Mr. Goldwater. Inspired me, and you've inspired all of these very dedicated freedom fighters who are traveling with me on this tour. Now, I'm not going to be long. I'm going to be very brief. I'm not here to make a speech. I'm here to make a plea, and I'm here to urge you to do something that I think you will do and something that I think you want to do. Suffice it to say that we stand in one of the most momentous periods of human history. And in these days of emotional tension, when the problems of the world are gigantic in extent and chaotic in detail, all men of goodwill must make the right decisions. And on Tuesday, 1 week from today, the people of this nation must decide whether they want America to remain true to the great words of the Founding Fathers. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We must decide whether those words will be firmly etched into the structure of our nation, or whether we will allow our nation to be relegated to a second-rate power in the world with no moral voice. We must decide next Tuesday whether America will take the high road of justice and peace, compassion for the poor and underprivileged, or whether this nation will tread the low road of man's inhumanity, the man of injustice, of short-sightedness. And I don't think any Negro and white person of goodwill will vote for Mr. Goldwater. Very seriously, never before in the history of our nation has a candidate for the presidency taken such a negative stand on the demands of our Judeo-Christian heritage for justice, and understanding, goodwill, and compassion for the poor and peace, as has Mr. Goldwater. And so all men of goodwill will go to the polls on November the 3rd, and I hope we will have a great day in our nation, so that when we wake up on the 4th of November, we will know that America has made the right decision.
Wow. I hope you have enjoyed our celebration of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Holiday 2022. We have a lot to do in 2022. Let's push to get Congressman John Lewis' Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2021 passed, which will restore and strengthen parts of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We must remember Dr. King's voice and mission when he said, "Give us the ballot." I believe his words of truth and justice stand as the centerpiece of our lives. No lie can live forever. Remember one of his many quotes, "I have decided to stick with love. Hate is too great a burden to bear." Thank you for tuning in. Thanks to all of our participants and supporters that helped us to make this celebration possible. A short shout out to our videographer, Mr. David Taylor. Peace and love. Thank you.
for only love can conquer hate. You see, we've gotta find a way to bring some love in here today. Oh, picket signs and COVID lines, don't punish me with brutality. Gonna talk to me so you can see. Oh, what's going on? Tell me what's going on. Picket signs and COVID lines, don't punish me with brutality. Come on, talk to me so you can see. Hey, what's going on?